Undercover boss sits for breakfast, freezes when waitress says she's been skipping meals due to low tips. It's raining this morning, but the real storm is waiting behind that foggy glass door. A rented Ford pickup truck rolled slowly into the parking lot, raindrops streaming down the windshield like tense nerves, sinking with each swipe of the wiper blade. Inside, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper stubble, black-rimmed glasses, and a low-pulled baseball cap stared up at the flickering neon sign, Sunrise Diner, number 28, the branch with the second highest revenue in the entire system, but also the one with a turnover rate 3 times above average. On paper, everything looked fine. Reports stayed clean. The regional manager kept praising it as smooth and efficient. But Derek Langston, founder and CEO of Sunrise Restaurant Group, wasn't someone who trusted spreadsheets at face value. He was the kind of man who'd throw on faded jeans, a flannel shirt, and worn-out shoes just to have breakfast like a regular customer, not out of nostalgia, but because he knew some things only reveal themselves when you step back and blend in. 7:30 a.m., breakfast rush hour begins. Derek adjusted his cap, flipped up his collar to hide the familiar face that had graced more than a few business magazines. Today, he was Walt Simmons, a retired long-haul trucker visiting his daughter. The cover story had been carefully prepared, a gravelly voice with a hint of southern twang, wandering eyes that noticed everything, and a quiet question brewing deep inside. Why are the customers plenty but the staff unstable? Why this strange chill behind the familiar glow of that sign? Inside, the cafe still smelled of coffee and buttery pastries just like any other day. But Derek knew it was like a song being played in the wrong key. No one paid attention to the middle-aged man walking in. And that was a good sign. Because today, he wasn't here to lead. He was here to listen. And that morning, what seemed like a normal breakfast became the starting point of an unexpected reckoning. Just a polite question. But the answer made him unable to swallow another bite. Cassie approached the table with a gentle smile and a nearly empty coffee pot. It wasn't the forced cheerfulness. It was the smile of someone clinging to decency, even when they themselves were running on fumes. The uniform sleeves were fraying, her name tag barely holding on, and the faint dark circles under her eyes peeked through the thin layer of makeup. Cassie wasn't just on the morning shift. She was carrying the whole thing on her shoulders. "I'll get you a black one, as strong as the sun that hasn't risen yet," she said, adding a well-timed wink, the classic Sunrise Diner touch. Derek nodded. His eyes followed the hands still pouring coffee steadily, even though her fingers trembled slightly, a sign of a long overnight shift without rest. This girl was clearly working double, maybe even triple the amount compared to the 2 male colleagues who were chatting near the espresso machine. Breakfast was served quickly. Perfectly soft-boiled eggs, crispy bacon, moist and fragrant pancakes, everything impeccable. But it was that very perfection that made Derek even more uneasy. Because how could someone so precise and efficient carry such a weary look in her eyes? As Cassie passed by, he let slip a comment. "You seem to be the only one really working here this morning." She paused for a beat. Her eyes glanced back slightly, as if to make sure no one else heard, then bowed her head and, while pouring more coffee, whispered, "Morning shift's the worst, tips are low. And, even when they're shared, only a few people actually get them. Just one sentence. Light as a breeze." But it squeezed Derek's chest. His hand froze above the fork and knife. Steam still rose from the cup of coffee, but inside him, a cold wave surged from the heart, upward. Not because she complained, but because she didn't. She merely stated it softly, like someone already used to being left out of the equation. This wasn't about performance or service anymore. It was about a system that had gone wrong right inside the very restaurant Derek once proudly called a model of fairness. Derek sat up straighter, eyes fixed on the girl darting between 3 tables at once, clearing plates, pouring drinks, still smiling. He knew this breakfast was no longer a sight check. It had just become a covert investigation. And Cassie, though she didn't know it, had triggered it with a whisper nearly lost in the noise. Injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it whispers from behind the coffee counter, leaving traces only seen by those who know how to look. Cassie wasn't the fastest, but she was the only one truly busy. Derek counted 12 tables, all handled by her. No breaks, no stops. Meanwhile, the 2 male servers, Ryan and Jason, leaned near the coffee station, each handling just 4 tables, still had time to joke, occasionally glancing at Cassie as if she were entertainment. There were even times when, as customers from Cassie's section paid at the table, Ryan would step in and grab the card reader. Again and again, Cassie served, they processed the payments, and Cassie? She simply nodded and stepped back, as if that was just the way it works. Derek didn't need any more reports. He was watching the truth directly, clearly, and without being dressed up in polished terminology. When he casually asked, "Tips going all right this morning?" Cassie just gave a tired smile, but as she turned back with the receipt, she let slip a whisper like someone wanting to speak but afraid of her own words. "We share digital tips, but only those assigned in the system actually receive them. The rest, well, they say it'll all be evenly split at the end of the day. But since last month, I still don't know what evenly means." Outwardly, Derek stayed composed, but inside, the instincts honed from over 30 years in the FB industry lit up like wildfire. This wasn't just a lopsided shift, it was a system being deliberately skewed. The name Doug began appearing more frequently in his mental notes, the manager with the aloof stride and eyes too sharp to be called unaware. Doug had been promoted from a smaller branch based on flawless numbers that Derek now suspected were built on polished facades, not genuine workforce equity. Ryan, the young employee Doug constantly praised in regional meetings, just so happened to be his nephew. And coincidentally, the person who almost always controlled POS system access each morning. Derek logged every interaction, how Ryan always showed up just as Cassie's customers were ready to pay, how Doug called Ryan aside with laughter while the others were still hustling, a structure tilted completely to one side, where those without family ties bore the burden. At the end of the shift, Derek gently called Cassie over, this time to ask a question, no longer small talk. "If this was the place my daughter wanted to work, what would you say?" She hesitated, then gave a faint smile. Not sarcastic, just the kind of smile worn by someone who had stopped expecting fairness to happen on its own. But then, as if something in him urged her to break the surface, Cassie subtly sat down back straight, eyes still cautious. "You really want to know?" And she began to tell him about how Doug created secondary roles in the system with no access to digital tip allocations, about how Ryan was almost always given the morning shifts, the time frame with the highest volume of card payments, about how "we'll split it evenly at the end of the day" was a phrase nobody actually verified. Then Cassie pulled from her pocket a small notebook. No complaints, no pleas for help. She had recorded every shift, every card swiped by a customer, every number the system logged, and the actual amount she received. "Just this month, I lost over $600. I'm not guessing. I recorded every transaction. But if I file a report, I know what will happen. The person who speaks up loses their shifts first." Derek looked down at the notebook, then up at Cassie's eyes, not the eyes of someone weak, but the eyes of someone enduring because they have no other option. And he knew justice doesn't appear on its own. It has to be built by the hands of those who witness. And today, he had witnessed. Derek said nothing at first. He simply sat in silence, looking at the notebook, every line neatly written, showing dates, times, table numbers, total bills, and $0 in the tips column. Each entry was a piece of evidence, but also a stifled sigh buried beneath professionalism. Cassie sat upright. She didn't justify. She wasn't seeking pity. She needed someone who would truly listen. "What were you planning to do with this notebook?" Derek asked, his voice quieter than usual. She shook her head. "At first, it was just to remind myself I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't imagining this. But then each day brought another injustice. Eventually, it became evidence. But what's the use of evidence when the person who's wrong is the one assigning shifts, locking the terminals, approving requests?" Derek leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting from the notebook to the hidden corners of the diner. A dishwasher struggling with a loose faucet. A younger waitress, likely new, stationed in an unseen corner. Not taking orders, just standing there like a backup character no one needed. "Does Doug usually show up in the mornings?" Derek asked, almost offhand. Cassie nodded. "Morning is the golden shift. Busy customers. Higher digital tips. Ryan's always given the lead. And Doug's there just long enough to ensure everything goes as planned. He doesn't need to shout, just a glance is enough. And the others? Do they suspect?" She paused a beat. "Some do, but most choose silence. Someone tried to speak up their schedule, disappeared for 3 weeks. Another's time off request got denied. One new hire lost shifts repeatedly just because I accidentally touched the POS terminal she left open." Derek slowly sipped his now cold coffee. The bitterness was intact, but now it was easier to swallow because he understood exactly what needed to be digested. This wasn't about tips anymore. It was about a management structure warped at the core, where power was twisted to serve personal gain instead of collective fairness. "Do you think someone else might be keeping records like you?" he asked. Cassie looked at him for the first time with genuine confusion in her eyes. "I don't know, but if someone else is doing it, I'm sure they're just as scared as I am. Evidence doesn't save anyone if no one stands by you. Derek didn't say he was the CEO, didn't mention that he was the other side of this very system. Instead, he took a pen from his shirt pocket and gently placed it on the notebook. If one day you decide to send this, don't send it to the regional manager. Send it straight to headquarters internal audit division. Recipient A. Murray, that's my executive assistant. Cassie looked at him for a long time, then nodded softly. Outside, the rain had started to ease. But inside Sunrise Diner number 28, another kind of storm was quietly brewing from a look, a small notebook, and a sentence that could never be replayed. Derek stood up, left a few loose coins on the table, just enough not to raise suspicion, but still enough for Cassie to understand. He didn't come here for breakfast. He came to begin an investigation and perhaps a reckoning. Some revolution don't need slogan. They just need clear data and the right person at the right table at the right time. That afternoon, Derek Langston left Sunrise Diner without looking back. The air was still damp from the rain, but in his mind, the real storm was just beginning with one phone call. "Mara," he said as the line connected, "I need you to initiate a full investigation, Diner number 28, classification, top secret internal. Start with the POS. I suspect someone is manipulating the tip distribution system." Oh, Mara didn't ask twice. The head of internal audit, with nearly 15 years of experience, had once said something Derek never forgot. No system goes wrong unless someone quietly rewrites the rules. 48 hours later, the data from Diner number 28 arrived in a confidential report. Derek read every line without blinking. Doug, the branch manager, had created a secondary employee role in the POS system 3 months ago. Employees assigned this role could not access the digital tip-sharing section. Cassie was one of them. Most card-based tips were auto-routed with 67% going directly into the account of Ryan, Doug's nephew. The remaining cash tips were recorded as to be split at end of day, but no documented or signed allocation sheets existed for verification. Worse, Mara traced a hidden business account under the name Douglas Henderson LLC, a legal entity opened by Doug, receiving periodic internal service fees from Sunrise Diner. The sum matched the amount of missing cash tips. Derek didn't explode. He just sat in silence for a long time. Then he closed the laptop and told Mara, "We don't send an email. We don't call a private meeting. We show up at the exact moment they still think they're in control." The plan was drawn up in under 3 hours. Derek would return to the diner on Friday, peak morning hours, undercover as before. Mara would be disguised as a customer acting as Derek's daughter visiting town. The IT team would quietly switch the branch's POS to real-time monitoring mode. The legal and internal audit teams would arrive at the branch office at 9:15 a.m., right when the morning rush was in full swing. 9:03 a.m. Friday. Sunrise Diner branch number 28 was bustling as usual. The scent of hot coffee, buttered pastries, and cheerful chatter made it feel like a cozy, well-run spot. Cassie was still running the floor solo, handling Zone A by herself. Ryan, as usual, stationed himself at the POS system, occasionally helpfully processing payments from Cassie's tables. Doug stepped out of the office in a light gray dress shirt, flashing a polite smile at a regular customer, then scanned the diner like a smug director admiring his well-rehearsed play. And then Derek walked in. No more baseball cap, no more sunglasses. Just the CEO of Sunrise Restaurant Group in a navy suit, heading straight for the counter amid the bustling breakfast scene. Following him was a young daughter, Mara, holding a laptop, eyes sharp as steel. Ryan froze. Doug blinked, then forced a stiff smile. "Mr. Langston, I didn't know you were coming. If I had, I would have prepared." "You've prepared enough, Doug." Derek's voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the diner. He turned to face the dining room. The room began to fall silent. "I'm the founder of Sunrise, and today I didn't come here to taste pancakes. I came to make this clear. Starting tomorrow, all tips at this diner, digital or cash, will be transparently displayed in real time, with the server's name and exact tip breakdown." Cassie froze, nearly dropping the tray of coffee in her hand. Derek turned back to Doug, now visibly sweating. "And you, Doug, as of this moment, are suspended. The account, Douglas Henderson LLC, will be handed over to federal investigators. Ryan, same for you. 67% of tips don't just magically land in the hands of a manager's nephew. I don't believe in that kind of coincidence." "Oh," Doug opened his mouth, but Derek raised a hand. No more words were needed. And right there, during an ordinary morning rush, in a place usually filled with the clatter of utensils and ordered tickets, The truth was laid bare like sunlight cutting through a thin cloud, clear, decisive, and undeniable. A revolution that started with a whisper, ended in a silence everyone understood. The silence of justice when someone finally speaks up. Derek stepped forward, placing both hands on the counter, the exact place where countless invisible transactions had taken place. Not dramatic, not rushed, but every eye in the diner turned toward him. I know there are people here who saw wrong but didn't know where to start. Some stayed quiet, thinking, even if I speak, nothing will change. And someone recorded everything just to preserve a bit of fairness for herself. Cassie lowered her head. Her shoulders trembled slightly. For the first time in many months, she no longer had to avoid anyone's gaze. Derek looked to Mara. She gave a slight nod and opened her laptop at the counter. The screen displayed the POS system in real time, with a live tip-sharing dashboard. Every transaction, every employee ID, every tip amount, every split. Everyone in the diner saw their name appear on the screen for the first time. This isn't punishment, this is light, Derek said. And I believe, when there's enough light, those who truly do the work will be seen. In another corner, a shy dishwasher stepped out from behind the counter and gently placed a stack of photocopied papers on the countertop, handwritten tip distribution records she had quietly kept for several weeks. Derek took them, nodding gently to her. Thank you, you're not alone. At that moment, staff from the central office entered. No noise, no inspector badges, just name tags, worn quietly, as they walked straight toward the manager's office. Doug stepped back, but no one asked him to stop. Their presence alone was enough to make him understand. Ryan looked around, his eyes red. The young man who thought he had outsmarted the system was now just someone trapped in a game whose rules he never truly understood. Cassie stepped closer, still keeping a respectful distance, but this time, she stood tall. No more whispering. And for the first time, she spoke loud enough for the entire diner to hear. Thank you for coming, not as a CEO, but as someone brave enough to listen. A slow round of applause began from the back tables, where the veteran staff usually ate breakfast in silence before starting their shifts. Then the next table joined. Then the entire diner. No one clapped because Doug was fired. They clapped because someone had finally brought the truth into the light. And on what seemed like a perfectly ordinary morning, one small diner, among countless other Sunrise Diner locations, became the starting point of a new movement. A place where employees no longer had to carry notebooks as living proof, but could finally believe that justice wasn't something to be tucked away in a uniform pocket. Derek didn't say anything else. He simply laid one hand on the counter, the same place where so many redirected transactions had taken place, then turned and walked out. Mara followed. But before she left, she looked at Cassie and said quietly, "We need a temporary manager, someone who truly understands what it feels like to be pushed out of the system. If you're ready, we'll begin from here." Cassie didn't answer right away, but her eyes, they shone brighter than any spoken reply. On what seemed like just another Friday morning, justice didn't knock. It walked in when someone was brave enough to open the door. Justice doesn't knock. It walks in when someone dares to stand up and keep it there. 2 weeks after that turbulent confrontation, Derek Langston returned to Sunrise Diner, branch number 28. Still disguised as Walt, the middle-aged dad in a worn-out ball cap and an old jacket. And with him was his daughter this time, Mara, beaming in a plain hoodie, carrying another laptop, but still with the same sharp eyes as before. Inside the diner, everything seemed normal. Customers still filled the seats. Coffee was still hot. The scent of waffles gently floated through the cozy air. Doug and Ryan, just as expected, continued manipulating the POS counter operations, still directing customer flow in whatever way they deemed efficient. And there was Cassie, the main server, working twice as much, walking as quietly as always. But today, one thing had changed. Above the cashier counter, a tiny red light blinked, a signal that the real-time audio and surveillance system had been activated. Every spoken word, every POS action, every transaction adjustment, all were being recorded. Then, precisely at 9:15 a.m., the busiest moment of the morning rush, Derek removed his ball cap, stood up, and stepped into the center of the diner. This time, he didn't need to introduce himself. Nearly every employee already understood the act was over. He called everyone over. At the counter, Mara connected her laptop to the large screen above the payment station and displayed everything. The bias shift scheduling logs, the skewed tip distribution percentages, the altered transactions, and even an audio recording of a conversation between Doug and Ryan about their tricks for navigating the system. The air turned heavy. No one chewed waffles. No one poured coffee. Derek didn't raise his voice. He simply said one sentence. If a system was built for fairness, then anyone who breaks it, manager or staff, has no place at Sunrise. Doug was terminated on the spot. Ryan too. But more importantly, the process of correcting the system had begun at its root. In the following 3 weeks, all POS systems across every Sunrise Diner location were updated. Every transaction now displayed the server's name, table number, tip percentage, and designated recipient. Cash tips were logged through each staff member's personal ID with end-of-shift signatures and optional verification with the customer in case of disputes. A new tip-sharing system online, transparent, real-time was implemented with open access for all relevant staff. Each month, a tip profit-sharing report would be sent individually to every employee, no more vague, equal splits that no one could track. And Cassie? She was invited to the central office a week later. After a meeting that lasted more than an hour, Mara emerged from the room, smiling more brightly than even the day she exposed the wrongdoing. Cassie became the regional training lead, responsible for coaching new branches on tip management, fair service practices, and professional ethics. 1 month later, Sunrise Diner, Branch 28, still opened its doors at 6 a.m., still bathed in its familiar warm yellow lights. But this time, something had changed in the air. No more wary glances during shift changes. No more silently placed coffee trays tucked behind the POS wall. At the center of the counter, a small digital screen glowed. Tip sharing, live vertical bar, transparent vertical bar, verified. Each transaction clearly displayed. No one had to ask, will tips be split today? Just look up and see. Cassie stood in the middle of the diner, clipboard in hand, reviewing the new system with a group of freshly onboarded employees. Her voice was quiet but firm. Right person, right task, right share. You don't need to be the fastest. Just be real. Derek sat quietly at his old table. In front of him, a cup of coffee, this time hotter than the first. When he stood to leave, he slipped a folded $20 bill under his half-eaten plate. No one saw him walk out. Only when Cassie came by to clear the table did she find the bill, and underneath it, a handwritten note. Thank you for not giving up, even when no one stood by you. Today, you are no longer alone, and no one else will be left behind. Fairness doesn't just appear. It is nurtured by those who were once overlooked, but never stopped believing that kindness is the only way to sustain anything worth building. Cassie folded the note gently, as if afraid to crease something sacred. She told no one. She simply tucked it into the same notebook that once logged every underpaid shift and every transaction someone else took credit for. But this time, that notebook was no longer a record of injustice. It had become the journal of a new beginning. From that day forward, every training Cassie led began with one simple question. If a teammate is behind the counter, sweat dripping from serving too many tables, and still doesn't get the tips they deserve, would you speak up? Not a theoretical question. It's the one that redefined the spirit of Sunrise Diner. At another branch all the way across the country, a staff member named Talia sent an email of thanks. For the first time in her 2 years working there, she could see her tips in real time, no longer having to wait for the manager to print a summary at the end of the week. At a shareholder meeting 3 months later, when someone asked about the financial impact of the tip transparency policy, Derek gave a simple reply. We didn't just retain customers. We retained the conscience of those who served them. Then he invited Cassie to speak. She didn't use slides, not due to a lack of applause, but because in that room, everyone was asking themselves, was there someone in our own system like Cassie, still being silently excluded from the circle of fairness, simply because no one dared to speak up? On his final return, Derek came to the diner without a laptop, without disguise. He walked in like an old regular, in the truest sense. Cassie was showing a new employee how to process tips in the updated system. When she saw Derek, she only smiled. No rush to greet him, no surprise. As if they both understood one another in a language that required no words. She handed him a cup of coffee without needing to ask how he liked it. Today's a special day, she said. Derek raised an eyebrow, asking silently. Cassie gestured toward a row of tables in the back where 2 interns were entering data into the system, laughing freely. One of them had once been the dishwasher hidden behind the counter for 3 straight months. That's the first batch trained under the new policy. And the first I didn't have to teach how to endure. I just teach them how to do things right. Because now, the system stands on their side. Outside, sunlight angled through the window, casting a golden honey-colored glow on the table. Derek took a sip of coffee, slowly nodded. No big speeches, no nameplate unveiling, just a moment of quiet. The kind of peace that those who uphold fairness always deserve to receive. Because justice doesn't always arrive with a knock at the door. It often begins with one person brave enough to save a seat for what's right, even when the whole room has gone silent.